Hello, this is your teacher, James Zucker, and I am going to each week be giving some content to help you out with teaching the APUS history class. I know for some of you who are veterans to the class, this is nothing new. You've been doing this for some time and you understand all the major core content that you need on the concept outline. For those of you who are new to the class, hopefully this will help out in establishing some of the core issues that you should be discussing during the year. For those of you guys who have been teaching the class for a while, my hope is that this helps out. What I've done with the concept outline review for each week is that I've gone through the overall framework that the College Board has provided, and I picked out what are the most important themes, the most important concepts, the most important thinking skills that need to be taught inside the class in order to meet each one of those time periods. So I'm hoping this will help you out as we go through each week. And in this first concept outline review, I've included periods 1 through 3 on the APUS history, general description, and the concept outline. So the first period is the 1491 to 1607 period. This is really the period of the beginnings of Native Americans within the APUS history format. Also, I think the other big thing here is the contact between Native Americans and Europeans. And I think this is one of the areas that a lot of APUS history teachers struggle on, about how to make this relevant and what are the big concepts that you should be teaching. So here's how I approach it, as well as here's what's done with inside of the concept outline. The big focus is really to move away from a monolithic notion of the American Indian. Instead of teaching the American Indian as basically one group of people, you're teaching it about being multiple different groups of people. So for example, in the Northeast natives, I teach as being a part of the river systems, that trade is incredibly important, especially in the Ohio River Valley, and that confederations are formed over time periods in order to deal with the wars that took place between these natives, and then the regulation of their trade routes between the different tribal groups. In the Midwest, Plains Indians were nomadic Indians that moved from place to place based upon wildlife. In the Southwest, there were nomadic movements as well, but they were based much more upon the geography of the desert and fishing. And then in Mesoamerica, we have the large empires. And what I love about teaching this, I get to teach this both in AP World History and AP US History as well, is that I like to make the comparison between the Mesoamerican empires and the empires of Europe. At this time period, the Mesoamerican empires, especially the empire of the Aztecs, was at least as comparable to Europe, if not stronger at this time. In fact, the city-states of the European kingdoms were dwarfed by the Aztec Empire. And when you consider that the Aztec Empire was formed within the desert of the Mexican region, it's rather amazing that the Aztecs were able to take their irrigation system known as chimpañas. Those were basically these framework areas where they would store water, and they were able to do this in order to support a population that was larger than most European areas. Now, the way that this happened was that the original people in the area were the Toltecs. They were then replaced by the Olmecs, and eventually their civilization collapsed. We don't know exactly why that happened, but our guess is it had to do with an environmental collapse. That was then filled by the Aztecs down into the Central American region, and then going down to South America, where the Mayans and the Incas. And one of the big things I think to point out, and this is a crossover to the AP World History as well, is the importance of trade routes, especially including the Andes Mountains and the items for trade that were used, especially that of maize. Now this is where it gets kind of interesting. The Andes Mountains are incredibly difficult to traverse, but the Incas were able to maintain large trade routes within the Andes Mountains, traded back and forth going all the way up to the Aztec region. One of the interesting things, and this has oftentimes been pointed out in AP World History, as to why Native Americans would eventually have a difficult time when they came into contact with Europeans. There are multiple different reasons that are given for this. Some of them may be given in this PowerPoint, but two of the sort of biological and geographical reasons had to do with the production of food and the production of pack labor at this time. So within the European and what are called the Euro-Asian area, typically the food that was produced there were called cereal grains, and they tended to have certain pack animals, for example, horses, eventually camels, and cows. Whereas within the Andes Mountain region, the most important produce was maize, and they tended to use the llama to move things back and forth. So here was the disadvantage that came out of that. Maize is not quite as nutritious or hardy, and llamas don't carry quite as much as cows do, or eventually camels and horses did. And so that eventually did put Native Americans at a bit of a disadvantage in the exchange with Europeans. So one of the ways that we kind of think about this exchange at the time was called frontier encounters. These were encounters with natives and Europeans, and the way that you can look at this and teach it to the kids is that in many ways these were frontier wars. In other words, these were large empires, and what they were fighting for were the boundaries on the edges of these empires. That was true for Europeans, for example, with New Spain, which was formed all the way from California down into the Mesoamerican region, was largely about silver extraction, the spread of Catholicism, and a national fight between what are known as the Creoles and the Peninsulares. The Peninsulares were people who were born in Spain and came over to the New World. Creoles were people who were of birth of people from Spain, but they were born here in the so-called New World. New France was different from New Spain in that it was based upon trading outposts with a spreading out of the military. New France on the North American continent was the largest of all the empires, which is rather surprising in the long run because New France is going to fall away pretty quickly. But one of the reasons why that may have been the case is because New France was established as a trading outpost with military. That differs from New England, which was the smallest of all the empires, yet they were based upon family-based settlements within mercantile trade over the Atlantic Ocean. And possibly this is what gave them their advantage. Being family-based, over the long term, they had the greatest amount of stability. What's interesting about this, though, it has to do with the native reactions. And this is what I like to try to teach to the kids, is that this is why we don't look at the natives as being monolithic. Rather, the natives are like their own empires competing amongst each other and also competing with the Europeans. And they had strategies to do this. So, for example, they would form trade alliances with different empires. They also tried to create a balance of power by playing one European empire off of the next. And within their own empires, they then had to deal with the question of whether or not to keep their traditional native faith or to attempt to accommodate the new phase that were coming in from the European side. Trade versus oppression. So the students really need to see this notion that if you try to create this notion of trade versus oppression, or the notion of like one side is good, the other side is bad, it's really what we call a binary description, either or, that's way too simplistic. Hernan Cortez conquered the Aztecs due to the Quetzalcoatl myth and the tributary conflict with other native groups. So what does that mean? When Hernan Cortez came, one of the biggest mistakes students make is to think there was technology that allowed him to conquer the Aztecs. Most historians think that's not true. The Aztecs, first of all, outnumbered Hernan Cortez and the Spanish. And on top of that, at the time period, even though Cortez had the cannon and he had the gun, the cannon and the gun at that time period were not that well sophisticated or developed. They really should have lost in this war against the Aztecs. But the Aztecs believed in what was known as the Quetzalcoatl myth, meaning they believed that Hernan Cortez was the return of the god Quetzalcoatl, who had been exiled from Mexico a long time ago and was coming back to save them. And so Hernan Cortez and his men were brought into the Aztec Empire, where they were able to defeat the Aztecs from within. However, the other reason why they were able to defeat had to do with this tributary conflict. The Aztecs had kept native groups in a tributary relationship. Once the Aztecs were conquered and these other groups were also conquered, they were then put into an encomienda system, which allowed for the Europeans to use the natives as a slave-based system for silver extraction. This eventually led to a rebellion within the Southwest called the Pope Rebellion, in which the Spanish were kicked out by the local natives because they were so upset at the poor treatment that they were being given under an encomienda system. Eventually, the Spanish were able to come back in, but what ended up happening was the Spanish adopted a more assimilationist mode in which they assimilated natives back and forth. Up in the Northeast, the Iroquois Confederation traded between the French and the English in order to keep a balance of power. Now, my hope is what you can see here is that this is a very complex relationship. We have, for example, the Aztecs losing in many ways because of their own oppression of local native groups through the tributary system. We have the Pope Rebellion, in which the Spanish are kicked out due to oppression, yet in order to come back in, they then deal with a cultural assimilation. Or in the Northeast, we have the Iroquois Confederation acting like a European empire in many ways, trading back and forth between the French and the English. In other words, I think the notion of trade versus oppression is just too simplistic. What we want the students to see is that there was trade, there was oppression, and in many ways we have a mixture, and it goes back to that idea of the frontier wars. So cultural interactions. So cultural diffusion occurred in all of the different communities. The Puritans up in the Northeast often complained, for example, of defectors going out into the local native communities. The Columbian Exchange demonstrated how the Europeans would gain potatoes and maize from the local Native Americans. Natives, on the other hand, gained sheep, cattle, and coffee. And of course, we know that diseases were transferred onto both sides. Of course, the natives tended to have the worst of these bouts with smallpox, measles, mumps, and influenza. And this, of course, eventually opened the door for African slavery due to the centuries of contact between Europe and Africa. So while natives tended to die off most often because they had been isolated from Europeans, Africans had had such a long trading relationship with Europe that they were able to survive most of these diseases, and then they were used for slavery over in the New World. So this then leads into the second period, and in the second period we now transition not so much away from Native American and European interactions, but much more of a focus of Native Americans and more of the New England model of what was happening. So the British colonies, English colonies were generally settled, like we talked before, due to family settlements. The North and Northeast were characterized by religious diversity and mercantile trade. So it's up in the North and Northeast where we find everything from Puritans to Quakers. We also have the development of religious consciousness and the tolerance for that in Rhode Island. And we have mercantile trade going back and forth between Britain and these new colonies. The Chesapeake region, however, is characterized by moneyed interests, as you had sons of noblemen coming out trying to find gold and instead really ending up with land and eventually finding tobacco and using that tobacco as what they called brown gold. Both of these areas developed local representative governments that led to assemblies and a culture of local rule that would eventually challenge the virtual representation that Britain called for. So virtual representation was this notion that Britain virtually represented the interests of the colonies, even if colonists didn't get to directly vote. Eventually that would become probably one of the most central challenges within the American Revolution. The English conflict with the natives. The Puritans tried to convert natives, and that eventually led to fights over land and religion, especially the Pequot Wars. Settlements in the Chesapeake also led to wars like that of King Philip's War that created long-term tensions. And eventually, one of the biggest conflicts that the students need to learn about is the Bacon's Rebellion. And the reason why that's so important is that in many ways, that really transitioned us into African slavery. Slaves were then used after the Bacon's Rebellion in order to have a substitute for indentured servitude. And of course, as we know, within the Chesapeake, this is going to be really important because of the labor-intensive crop of tobacco. So they really needed to have some type of labor that would allow them to farm this. Initially, they did this with indentured servants, but when they didn't have enough land in order to reward these indentured servants, they looked for a less difficult labor to have to deal with, and that's when they turned to African slavery. So this then leads us up to the challenges to the imperial rule. The colonies had been formed by joint stock companies, or they were formed by royal charters. So they were either formed by private companies coming together and investing in these colonies, or by the king himself. The House of Burgesses in the Chesapeake represents the first example of local rule and local assemblies. Eventually this forms into the Great Awakening, in which new light religious leaders challenged the growing deism, but also the political role of the king over the English Anglican Church. So deism was the influx of Enlightenment thought into the American colonies. The New Lights reverted back to the Puritan beliefs and challenged this, and by doing that, they would challenge the English Anglican Church and the king himself, since he was the head of that church. At the time, Britain tended to follow the policy of benign neglect, which gave colonists local power and tended to really turn the attention away from any type of minor violations that might happen within mercantile trade. But once we get up close to the French and Indian War, there's this growing tension between British control and colonial local rule. Labor systems and race. So colonists used the headright system and indentured servants in order to fulfill their labor needs, especially within the Chesapeake. And remember, we talked about how there's really those labor-intensive products like tobacco and like rice. Switch to African slavery was meant to allow for a relief from providing land to indentured servants. Now, one of the biggest debates I like to go over with the kids at this point is, was slavery initially a race-based or economic system? Now, most of the kids probably are going to say it was an economic system, and they're going to say that based upon Bacon's Rebellion and the need to farm these crops. But one of the big questions I like to ask them is that if it really was only an economic system, then why is it that so quickly Africans were transformed for the first time in any slave-based system? They were transformed into purely economic products. In other words, a human being was seen as a piece of cargo that could be used in any type of way. And that opens up a discussion about where race and racism eventually got started. So now we get into period 3, which leads us right up into the American Revolution. So The biggest thing that I want them to see is that the American Revolution is a product of what are called the mercantile wars of the 1700s. So during the 1700s, there had been a number of wars over mercantilism. The most important in the American context is the French and Indian War. That takes place in the Americas, with the 7 Years' War taking place in Europe. England and the colonies at the end of the French and Indian War gained security in the North American continent. That's because the British were able to win this war. However, England also had a massive debt that they had to deal with. And another big problem that England will also have is that they negotiated land around the Ohio River Valley with the Native Americans in order to try to make sure that there would be peace within this region. This leads into two very controversial laws in 1763. First, the Stamp Act, which taxed paper goods in America to try to pay down that war debt, and the Proclamation of 1763, which was intended to restrict American settlements on the Ohio River Valley. So this starts to lead to this growing imperial tension. Prime Minister Grenville established the Stamp Act in order to pay off the war debt. Lord Rockingham repeals the Stamp Act after there had been numerous riots within Boston, but he provides for a justification for it based upon what was called the Declaratory Act, saying, hey, look, we definitely are not going to do this act. We will get rid of the Stamp Act, but we do it based upon British authority, and colonists need to respect that authority. Next, Prime Minister Townshend tries to respect the difference between internal and external taxation. This had been a big argument of the Patriots. Their argument was that the reason why they had opposed Britain was not so much because they were trying to pay off the war debt, but because unlike in the past with external taxes, which were tariffs, now they were trying to do internal taxes without colonial consent. That would be the Stamp Act. Well, even after Townshend attempts to do the external taxation, the Patriots still respond. They respond with the Boston Tea Party, and that completely changes the dynamic of how this was taking place. So that eventually leads then into the coercive acts, or the intolerable acts, which were passed in order to bring Massachusetts into line. And this then was reacted to by the American Patriots through non-importation societies, the creation of the Minutemen, and the Continental Congress. William Pitt, who becomes prime minister at this point, wants to try to create a reform in which he wants to compromise with the Americans, but King George III is fed up at that point and says there's no way they're going to do this. They need to close down all local assemblies and come down hard on the Americans. And I think what's important to see here, I just want to make a quick note, is that the American Revolution is one of those time periods where I think you can get really bogged down pretty quickly because there's so much that you could talk about, so many different laws and acts that were passed. These are really the big ones that the kids need to know. And if they know these big acts, you definitely bring in others, but if you know these big acts, the kids are really on a good path because it can demonstrate to them that how the Americans went from being loyal British citizens up to the time period of being willing to criticize the king and eventually break away from the king. I think one of the myths that the kids walk into is this notion that from the very beginning the Americans wanted to have their own independence. We know that wasn't the case until about 1776. That was the point when most Americans started to change their mind. So that leads into then, what are these new American ideologies and American identity? Because that's really important, of course, for one of the big themes that we talk about in American history. So it's important for the Americans to see that there really wasn't one big American ideology, but rather several of them. So civic Republicans believed that the revolution would be based upon a virtuous public. Lockeans argued this new notion that the government was a social contract based upon natural rights. Thomas Paine's Common Sense argued for a republic without a king that would be based upon local people's power. Women started to challenge the notion of their separate role. And this is one of those ones, the Republican motherhood is a very strange ideology. On the one hand, it argued for women to still remain in the household, but they now had a leadership role because they were changing the leadership of the next generation. They were training them. And Jefferson makes a very interesting argument in what's called the Virginia Clause of the Declaration of Independence, in which he challenges slavery. He says that just as slaves are oppressed, so too we are being oppressed by the king. This actually had to be forcibly removed from the Declaration of Independence. Remember, this is Thomas Jefferson who eventually defends slavery after the American Revolution, governing a nation. So the post-revolutionary period proved problematic for a number of reasons. And the kids need to know about this is that, one, there was a weak central government. Americans now faced their own war debt and internal rebellions. So eventually, a constitutional convention was formed, and it was primarily formed based upon a series of compromises. The compromise has had to do with representation, the Great Compromise, the Electoral College, and the issue of the slave trade. Federalists and Anti-Federalists vehemently disagreed upon what type of government we were going to have, with the Federalists wanting a strong centralized government sharing power with states, and Anti-Federalists wanting all the power really localized in the state governments. Eventually, there was a compromise, and the compromise was to have the Constitution, but to move the capital close to Maryland so that states in the South would be able to supervise it, and to have a Bill of Rights to protect states' rights. But the real balancing power from here on out, the real balancing act, would be how do we balance between states' rights and central government power? And that brings up the Washington administration and its foreign policy agenda. So the two main conflicts that kids need to know about is the war debt and the French Revolution. The war debt was eventually handled through Alexander Hamilton, through tariffs and the National Bank. Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson disagreed on the constitutionality of the National Bank, and so this brings up this great opportunity to teach about everything from a loose versus strict construction of the Constitution, the issue of tariffs and taxes on farming goods and how that affected local farmers like the Whiskey Rebellion and the National Army. The French Revolution also led to a fight between farmers and merchants over what kind of society we were going to have. And finally, Washington finished his administration by exiting America from the Franco-American alliance. And by doing that, he would establish this really important doctrine that would influence the rest of American history, the Neutrality Proclamation. So, what are the takeaways? There's a lot of material here to cover with the kids, but what are the major takeaways that I would suggest for you to consider? First off, the first major period really stresses those frontier exchanges, trade and battles, and for them really to see that just as much as Europeans are fighting between different empires, Native Americans are in the same position. There should be a stress on the different new empires of France, England, and Spain. You want to do some comparison and contrast to those. And the natives play a very clear role in the Columbian Exchange and the different labor systems as well as sharing of culture. The second major period is a growing tension between America and Britain. I think it's important for the kids to see that Americans did not want independence until long into the American Revolution, that really this was a growing independence based upon the notion of self-governance. And then the third major period is how, once the revolution is over, how is the U.S. going to establish its national law and foreign policy in the midst of the context of the French Revolution?